What is it about vampires that terrifies but intrigues the human mind? Although some people think traditional and modern vampires are the same, they are actually very different because of their characteristics and origins. Lilith is considered to be the first vampire and portrayed the characteristics of a traditional vampire. Lilith was the first wife of Adam, but was ultimately banished from Eden. As punishment for her sin of devouring children, she was turned into a vampire. Because Lilith was considered to be the first vampire, she inspired vampire stories such as Dracula. Lilith is the basis for the typical characteristics that we see in traditional and modern vampires. Cain is also considered to be one of the first vampires that ever existed. Cain was the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, but he was banished from his parents' land for killing his brother out of jealousy. Cain was wandering and found Lilith near the Red Sea, and she showed him the power of blood. Together they created more vampires and demons. Lilith and Cain's relationship is important in order to understand where vampires came from. Without Lilith and Cain, the characteristics of modern and traditional vampires could be very different. Originally a follower of Christ, Judas Iscariot became one of the most recognizable vampires. Judas betrayed Christ to the Romans, and in his guilt he committed suicide. His punishment for his sin of committing suicide was to come back from the dead as a vampire. His characteristics are similar to those of traditional vampires. He could even be the reason why silver harms vampires. He felt enormous guilt for what he had done and tried to make up for his sin, but instead he was shunned and cast away by everyone. Since the beginning, when vampires were first created, they have changed and evolved over time. People were fearful of the first vampires and tried to find ways to stop or kill them so they wouldn't be harmed by vampires. People used several techniques to stop vampires from rising from the dead. People would place garlic in the mouths of the deceased, put cages around coffins, and even drove stakes through the hearts of the dead because they believed if the body was pinned to the earth, they couldn't become vampires. These early means of killing vampires evolved over time, just as vampires have evolved. Some procedures for dealing with vampires have changed over time, but originated from the tactics used by people when the first vampires arose in the beginning when the earth was created. Traditional vampires like Dracula existed during the Victorian era. Vampires were perceived as monsters during this time and were not embraced by society. Life after death describes a vampire's existence and the belief that vampires were dead but lived off of human blood. Traditional vampires rose from the dead and then retreated back to the grave to rest. People kept away from vampires during this time out of fear. The modern vampire is viewed very differently from early and traditional vampires. Modern vampires are not usually viewed as ugly monsters like traditional vampires were. Modern vampires live much differently than traditional vampires. Many are considered to be beautiful and even sexy. Some are also portrayed as rich and sometimes own human slaves. Modern vampires appear human-like, although they are still considered to be dead. They still have a craving for blood, although not all of them have the fangs of traditional vampires. Modern vampires are believed to be more powerful, richer, and more beautiful than traditional vampires. Traditional vampires of the Victorian era and Industrial Revolution were well known in Europe. Many traditional vampires existed during the Victorian era. The Victorian era and Industrial Revolution was a time of change, and the landscape or environment that traditional vampires lived in was constantly changing and challenging. Life during the Industrial Revolution was hard and not ideal for many. Traditional vampires lived in many different places, and even among normal people, which caused townspeople to find ways to repel vampires. Traditional vampires normally came out and caused mischief in towns at night. People living in the Victorian era feared vampires and wanted to get rid of them. Vampires were well known in England during the Victorian era. Most people throughout England had similar beliefs about vampires and to get rid of them or kill them. People in England feared vampires and were scared that the vampires would come to harm them and maybe even turn them into vampires. People used traditional procedures to deal with or kill vampires when they believed they had come in contact with a real one. Many people across Europe shared the same views on traditional vampires. In the different countries throughout Europe, the vampire was portrayed as a monster, and the different ways to deal with vampires varied slightly. Countries across Europe shared similar ideas of how to kill vampires with England and the townspeople from the Dracula story. Because Dracula is an icon in the vampire world and originated in Europe, traditional vampires were more common in Europe than in other areas of the world.
Though modern and traditional vampires are quite similar as far as appearance, there are certain major aspects that differentiate them. Though modern vampires have brought them into pop culture, it was the traditional vampire that allowed this to even happen. In stories such as Twilight and shows such as Vampire Diaries, they show them as overly attractive individuals when vampires originally were depicted as rotten, pale, undead creatures. The most traditional vampires have the fangs in which they use to suck blood, but in more modern depictions, they have straight normal teeth like a human, and they don't need this blood to survive. The overall appearance has gone from terrifying to attractive. They stay young and beautiful forever instead of rotting and growing older, like the dead creatures they're supposed to be. Though vampires are considered stronger than humans, they are in fact demonic creatures and also have weaknesses. While the traditional vampires have a set amount of weaknesses, modern ones vary depending on the viewer. The most common weakness is exposure to sunlight. If they feel the heat of the sun, they burn up, but in more modern depictions, they tend to sparkle or just lose their power. Everyone knows that garlic keeps a vampire away, but that tends to be so well known that in the more modern day depictions, the vampires joke about it being a lie. Disposing of a vampire is pretty much the same, stab a stake through the heart, but then again, that would kill anyone. But it seems fire won't destroy them anymore, and that their skin will regenerate quickly. The strengths of a vampire are usually more in common, but the modern vampires have taken these lengths to the extreme. Vampires all over the world have been depicted with different strengths, but there is also something they all share in common. Their actual strength depends on the writer. More modern vampires have been able to run at super fast speeds and having Superman-like strength. Even the ways of feeding have changed. They are known to drink from animals or even plants, in the modern versions, leaving the blood sucking to parasites. The fact that society has changed the vampire is rather unsettling with the pictures and stories there are now. To help make this market more successful, they changed the look of the vampire to make it fit the current standard of beauty. They've made them sexier so young teenage girls will go crazy and buy everything that has to do with it. Along with looks, they made the characters relate to their problems. They can't fit in, they like this one girl/boy, and need to be super hot to get him/her. These stories tend to make being a vampire seem amazing, perfect, when really they are dead creatures with no soul. Vampires in modern-day society are no longer treated as monsters, but rather just like everyone else. Traditional vampires were once shown as hatred, monstrous creatures that were only made for destruction, while modern vampires are either loved by humans or they just don't know they're there. Vampires have always known how to hide in the shadows. They tried to fit in with humans and get by unnoticed so they won't be killed. Society has successfully changed the vampire through the best way it knows how: movies, books, and through the television. The three is mostly how everything changes, and when things go into the mainstream media, they never come out the same. Although modern and traditional vampires differ from one another, they do have some similarities because of their origins and demon-like characteristics. The once feared and terrifying figure known as the vampire is now just another money-gaining figure in modern society. Traditional vampires were viewed as ugly monsters with demon-like qualities, but now modern vampires appear to be more young and beautiful and more human-like.